So we're going to talk about Visionary Somatics. We're going to talk about the Rumpus Room, this experiment that it's a bit of a laboratory, a bit of an experiment that's inspired by R.D. Laing. At least the name is. The Rumpus Room comes from R.D. Laing, who was one of the founders of the anti-psychiatry movement and had this place called Kingsley Hall, the UK, where people that were psychotic or struggling with psychotic process, they would just come to this Rumpus Room where it was just safe to be performative and to just express whatever madness was there and be free to express the potencies of being.
Yeah, I remember you bringing him up a couple of times in class. What other inspirations or what else? Because I feel like Rumpus Room it's been a mixture of different things, like R.D. Laing, and this is one thing, but it's gone through different iterations. What else? What else contributes to this concept of Rumpus?
Yeah, it's a mosaic space. It's a bric-a-brac space that's constructed on like a clown's patchwork jacket or something, where there's bits from my trainings as a psychodrama facilitator, drama therapy, and so on. And there's bits from scientific research. My research is into immunology and neuroscience. So I bring some stuff off the cuff from my scientific research. And a lot of it is informed by my fascination and endless interest in the anthropology of ritual practice. So it's got that core element to it, my interest in ritual and specifically spontaneously arising ritual, as opposed to a preloaded construct. There's structure to it that I can fall back on, but essentially it's built to nurture spontaneity.
I like this idea of spontaneously arising ritual. That definitely, I think, speaks to what I've experienced in the couple of Rumpus Rooms that we've had. Yeah, what does that mean? Spontaneously arising ritual, and why is it important that there is that element of spontaneity?
Yeah, so Marino, the psychodrama theorist and founder, had this dialectic or this binary that he talked about in terms of human expression. He would talk about spontaneity versus what he called the cultural conserve. And the cultural conserve is a kind of achieved knowledge that's transmitted through generations and through text and through tradition and through structured ritual practices and ceremonies and so on. And it's a conserved element. It's a structural element. And he describes those structural elements as being seeded originally by spontaneity, so that the great religions, for example, and the great traditions and things of that nature were seeded by a spontaneously emergent genius or epiphany or some sort of insight that's just emerging in discourse and conversation or in singing or in some sort of reverie, collective reverie or something like that. And then those spontaneous elements get structuralized over time and become the cultural conserve. And he's not necessarily polarizing towards one or the other. He just saw his interpretation, his political interpretation, as it were, was just that spontaneity is underserved. It's an underserved population. And that's why he called psychodrama in the beginning spontaneity training, because he really saw how ubiquitous the cultural conserve was in these various cultural domains.
Why do you think it matters? Because I've heard you talk about the importance of spontaneity, the importance of, and this is reminding me too of the importance of play. Why, if we have this cultural conserve, why does it, and we've gone through this spontaneous elements to get to a cultural conserve, like why go back and be in this realm of spontaneity and play? Why does that matter? Why do that?
Because over time, the cultural conserve becomes rigid. It stops breathing and being alive. It just becomes a kind of cloning mechanism in a way and doesn't allow for much innovation or potency to breathe through the structure and reinvigorate it. And going back actually means going forward many times, in the sense that spontaneity reinvigorates structure, it cleanses it. And sometimes, of course, structure needs to be scoured and broken down in order to loosen things up and make it more porous and reinvigorate the structure. But that's the idea, that over time, structure crystallizes and creates less space for spontaneity, less space for life, for innovation. And then it just ends up being a kind of recapitulation of structure that ends up thwarting the fiercer edges of human freedom.
If I've never been to a Rumpus Room and I've never experienced this spontaneity or this play, could you explain to me, just in very concrete terms, how does doing this benefit me as a person, very concretely?
I suppose it energizes. It just has a way of giving energy rather than depleting. Structure gets into our bodies in a way. If when we're faced with a lot of rules and conventions and structures, like literally the breath can't enter the body as much, or tends to not enter the body as much. Even in structured breathing regimes, there ends up being a sense of just too much structure. So I think the concrete outcome is often energy and vitality. And what are the sorts of things that are done? Movement practices and practices that are designed to engage playfulness. So like enhancing one's ability to play essentially reduces one's neuroticism, I find. They're almost like two sides of a coin. You build the play function and the spontaneity function, and then the neuroticism function starts to diminish a bit. More energy and less neuroticism. How about that?
Okay. Trying to think of times when I find myself feeling a little neurotic, how that play could help me just in like daily life. I don't know if I consider myself a neurotic person. I guess you've talked about before, it's not a matter of if you have something, but it's where you have it and feeling through that. I like that element of the Rumpus Room too, that you've mentioned, of it being a place where we can locate where those things live in us, our neuroticism, our narcissism, our different elements, and bring them into the space to play with them, know them. Yeah, can you speak a little bit to some of that?
Yeah, let's take aggression, for example. Aggression is in the human. It's there. It's not really a question of is there aggression? It's where is it in this person and in this collective? And so aggression isn't seen as something to uproot and thwart and transmute and transcend. It's offered a place for creative expression. Now, that doesn't mean that safety isn't a concern, because safety is a concern. We don't want anybody to get hurt physically or anything like that, but to approach aggression like we would be in relationship with fire, aggression being a fiery thing, and fire serves, and fire cooks stuff, and fire does things that are protective, that serve life, and fire also burns and hurts, right? So it's just a matter of what the context is and how are we learning to be in relationship with that power. Are we using it creatively? Is there a defense against the aggression that doesn't allow the aggression to be played with? That's a different image, right? Playing with aggression rather than it playing you. Yeah.
I think that's one of my favorite. There's different Brian Tierney isms, I think, that you've said I've captured, and one of them is, can you play with X thing or is it playing you? And I think that helps to make us, or it helps to remove the idea that, oh, I don't have this thing, because we all have all of it. And it makes, and often seeing that it's like a kind of a double-edged sword in a way, where the same thing that can cut can heal, the same thing that it can be the negative side of something. Like aggression is a thing and it exists, and there is a positive aspect to it and there is a damaging aspect to it. But to negate it entirely, that starts to become problematic. And Rumpus Room is a place to feel into, or a place to explore maybe some of the more, maybe you can speak to like how I've experienced it as a place to really explore some of the more marginalized or elements of ourselves that we often try to deny or pretend to deny because they're not safe to explore in society. Yeah. What does that look like in Rumpus Room, and what are some of the benefits of contact?
One of the marginalized domains in the psyche, one of the most marginalized is madness. So like the mad parts inside, the chaotic parts inside that can erupt in moments of madness or aggression or something like that in family or in a certain situation or context, but it's quickly repressed and put back down, or it shows up in the oh so popular scapegoating dynamics in humanity, where the mad person is over there in the identified patient, or the sick person who's mad and crazy in the family system or in culture. And those people carry the madness energy, if you want to call it that, for us. And that's displacement, that's scapegoating. An alternative way of looking at it is that we all have mad parts. And similar to the aggression piece, those mad parts cut both ways. And if you repress it all, then you lose relationship with the potential energy of it, because there's a tremendous amount of potency in getting into this region of the psyche that will forever elude structure. It will forever, it is like oil and water, structure and anti-structure. There's anti-structural forces in culture and in the universe, and then there's structural forces, and there's a kind of drama playing out on a metaphysical level, on a political level, on a social level, on a family level. It cuts across systems. So to just get into this place of just wildness and freedom that has no container. But even though there is a container, the container is wide enough to hold that state and really set it free to express.
Mm-hmm. I like that you brought up structure and anti-structure, and I remember that being something you brought up really early on in your psychopathology class. And this is the balance that you've talked about of what is the definition of health, and this ability to move between or dance within structure and anti-structure. What role does something like the Rumpus Room and Visionary Somatics have in helping to strengthen that balancing act? And what does that look like?
So I was writing about the ancient Greeks today. I was writing about Tantric Buddhism. I was writing about the two in the same paragraph, which was fun. And I was writing about a Tibetan vampire ritual where the Bon tribes have an elaborate ritual practice of subduing and slaying vampires that are running amok in society. And in so doing, and in the process of the ritual, they do an incantation. At least this anthropologist was talking about the process where they're doing an incantation, where they were replaying the original event of the first vampire, who was actually rejected by her parents and thrown away and neglected and abandoned. And then later on, she was confused by her mother that her dream of coming back into belonging was in fact a delusion. And she basically went crazy and transmuted into a vampire, and then started coming after unborn children. But the ritual really, when you read the text and when you have an open mind and an open heart and an open belly, the text really tells a tragic story. It's a true tragedy, in the sense of, here we have a tragic situation where a vampire is created and scapegoated, and then that tragedy is somehow replayed in the ritual. And the purification and the community coming together and making meaning together is actually a tragedy. It's a dramatic tragedy that does a purification function for the community. And that's exactly what the ancient Greeks did. The Dionysus was the god of theater and the god of tragedy, right? And then on the ancient slopes of the Acropolis, right, there would be a invocation of the dismembered god, the mad god. And then a tragedy would take place on the stage, and the tragedy would serve a purification function for the community. And this structure anti-structure thing that plays itself out in culture can be understood as an irresolvable tension. This is not a resolvable tension. And then, so one of the strategies that comes from the arsenal of kind of an artistic or aesthetic approach to being and to therapy and so on, and to being human, is to make art of the inherent and irresolvable tensions that are in the universe and in culture. And that means putting on some of these ancient wisdoms that can actually actively invoke the tragedies that have existed throughout time and be purified by those tragedies, rather than trying to resolve the irresolvable tensions.
Is this the word that's coming to mind? Is this what they would talk about when they say catharsis? And
exactly, that's exactly the meaning of catharsis, is purification. That's the meaning of it. Yeah, exactly.
That's cool.
Yeah. And now, and I say tragedy very intentionally, because tragedy is in contrast to melodrama. This is another binary and another opposition. So melodrama is when you have a very clear line between what is good and what is bad. It is a very clear line, and those lines are very structural. Okay, they have to do with cultural conserves and with identity formations. They're heavily structured, and hence the horrible lines that are drawn throughout humanity around race and class and nation and religious persuasion and so on, where we do tend to see this sliding into a melodramatic us versus them. We are the pure and innocent ones, and the ones on the other side with a different language and a different way of making meaning and a different opinion, they're the bad ones over there. And that's melodramatic. And all sorts of tragedies, this is to go on to the other side of the equation, all sorts of tragedies arise out of this melodramatic binary of just, okay, this all good versus all bad. But what tragedy does is it opens up reality to what it was in the first place, which is complexity. Reality is complex. It's interwoven with elements that are maybe good, maybe bad. It's just, and the story of the vampire, the whole reason why she was a vampire in the first place is that she was abandoned and confused and hated on, and she was basically an orphan. And that's why she became what she became, and then she was hungry for blood, hungry for a dream, hungry for a place to be warm and all of that.
It's interesting that you said, tragedy comes out of melodrama, because the way I had started drawing it as I was taking notes was that tragedy was on the before side, and it was like the inability to reckon with the polarity, and the catharsis causes the
I think it's probably more like that, or they're probably just like consistent with the complexity. They're just like structure and anti-structure. They are constantly dancing and interpenetrating and grafting onto each other, and it's a hot mess.
I can see this, having this, for those that might want, again, concretizing, what does this mean for me personally or the world at large? But it sounds like this practice of being able to engage in the dance of structure, anti-structure, of being able to have the courage to grapple with tragedy, and maybe in a playful, humorous way to identify those parts, stops us or mitigates the tendency go into this binary of good and evil, and I'm right, you're wrong, and the saved and the damned, and the the self-righteous and the wrong. Those implications seem huge.
Yeah, they're huge, and I'm writing the book Visionary Somatics as an alternative trauma resolution approach, knowing that trauma is a really important discourse in this day and age. Awareness of trauma is building, and people are understanding how pernicious trauma is and how ubiquitous trauma is. And then one of the problems that goes with that, staying with this image of it can cut both ways. As trauma discourses rise, then we can start to see like this notion that trauma discourse itself can become traumatizing, meaning once you start to focus the lens on certain phenomenon, right? You start to see it everywhere, and trauma is contagious anyways. So not only do we have trauma being contagious and all over the place because it's contagious, we have the focusing of the lens on the trauma universe, and it's a basin of attraction. And trauma resolution work, I'm offering science in the book about trauma resolution and some methodology about how to do it, but I'm also wanting to offer a completely different basin of attraction, that where we can jump out of the trauma verse and find ourselves in a cosmos of innovation and invention, of co-creating a new space together. And we don't even know what that is. I just know that what I'm bringing through in the book, and there's a lineage to it. It does trace back to some wonderful authors like Ruth Lays, right, who wrote The Genealogy of Trauma, and really she's the one that threw down this phrase that trauma discourse has become traumatized, and that the age of the hero has turned into the age of the victim, and that the victim is the new hero. This is complicated stuff. It's like we could say that it's right that the hero should fall if that hero is one that's lording it over people and running a superiority trip or running a salvationist trip, or is quite unconscious about their claims to innocence, which is a lot of us, right? Unconscious about our claims to innocence. But what would it be like to jump out of all of those basins of attraction, which have a lot to do with identity? I talk so much in the Rumpus Room environment about how identity structures serve and how identity structures limit. I mainly talk about how they limit, because I'm coming from this place that humans are skin containers of multitudes. We're just a skin container of a swarm of molecules, and then we somehow convince ourselves that we're just one thing. And that's Hillman's great comment that the ego is a delusion of the monotheistic mind, that personality and identity structure really is fantasy. And we are made of multitudes. We have all sorts of different aspects of ourselves that come out in different environments and different contexts and so on. And having a really rigid identity structure can prevent us from connecting with the great multiplicity and the great basin of attraction that is a process of always becoming. And if you already have an arrived identity and it's a structure, then there isn't a place for the basin of power that is just a region of permanent novelty, and it's just spinning out innovations and novelty, and it just keeps on creating and creating, and also destroying. Yeah, and that's
I want to. Wow, that's a lot to process, and just even pick one thing from that. But this was something that I wanted to touch on today, was identity structures. And I'm curious how you talk about, if we can go to this spring that's it seems almost pre-identity or including, but it's deepened and expanding beyond. And there's this well of innovation and potential and possibility. How does something like the practice of visionary somatics, how does something like coming to a Rumpus Room help you to dismantle maybe some of these like rigid identity structures and deepen into this well of innovation and life force?
Yeah, the Visionary Somatics project is the kind of grand vision. It carries an intention of training practitioners in a 2-year long training. So it's a big project, it's a big book, and it's an attempt to articulate what some of the great ancient minds called Mathesis Universalis, which is essentially a combination of science, philosophy, art, ritual practice, and magic being the thing that's often either framed as superstitious mumbo jumbo nonsense, or on the other side, elevated as an identity consistent with what so many identity structures do, which is clone and multiply, informed by unconscious claims to superiority and innocence and so on, and just clone and clone and multiply, driven by a sort of salvationism. The big project is to bring in all of those threads, like a rigorous science of clinical science of trauma resolution and teaching neurobiology and so on, and clinical skills to actually interface with bodies, touch bodies. I was a touch therapist for many years and taught craniosacral therapy. And so there's a whole skill set to learn about conscious touch and navigating trauma and so on, and mindfulness practices and so on to self-regulate so that practitioners can weather the storms of intensity that come with approaching that basin of attraction. That's the trauma vortex, what Peter Levine called it. And that's just one leg of the journey. That's just one region, is the science part. Science is it's a perceptual field that has a way of sucking in the whole perceptual apparatus and the whole identity structure of the scientifically inclined. And then it can leave out other possibilities like philosophy, expressive arts, magic, and clowning around. So part of the Visionary Somatics vision is to teach clowns, basically. That clowning, in my view, and I'm Winnicottian in this sense, that play is so radically important for healing process that we, as to be whole practitioners, we need to have a clown and a magician, not the kind of stagehand type, even though the art of magic is literally the art of fascination. So to use the powers to fascinate with words and with gestures and with being in relationship with the great powers of being and becoming, and also it's not just that, it's like the anthropology of ritual, the anthropology of what ancient folks learned in terms of building a space for transformation. So it's not just magic hanging out as there in the field as like something to just, oh wow, that's mystical, we don't know anything about it or something. In the end, I suppose it's the mystery, but there are certain technologies and rituals that can be done, expressive arts practices and so on, that create an environment for that place of wonder where we're in relationship with the unknown, and that can be extraordinarily healing. So, and then all of this stuff is tied together in a philosophy that's articulated in the book, that's trying to hash out the dynamics of identity, using some science, using some philosophy, using some anthropology of ritual and so on. There's a piece about one of the innovations, or one of the elements that is core to the book and the approach, is that within the trauma resolution community, there's a stress on processes of self-regulation, regulating one's nervous system, slowing down, going into the vagus, into this parasympathetic region of more safety and a kind of nurturance of these self-regulatory processes. And that's quite good and is taught in the scientific and clinical aspects of the method. And also there's this understanding that our organisms are radically dynamic, moving back and forth between states of inhibition and quiescence and going into those chill zones to repair and generate new neural circuits and so on, and excitatory regions where things are quite active and moving and vibrant. And this is why I talk about, it's not just about regulation, it's about rave and regulate, or rock and roll and regulate, to learn how to plug into ecstatic states. And almost the definition of ecstatic states is the leaping out of structure, the leaping out of identity. And then what's there is a region of activation and ecstasy and movement and dynamism that can start to look like madness. And then we start to see a very dynamic tension starting to show up, which is what organisms do anyways, is a dynamic tension that's responsive to the environment. And it's a toggling back and forth between safety and structure and taking things slow and leaping and innovation and vitality and craziness and states of ecstasy and things of that nature, really wanting to invoke multiplicity and full spectrum. It's a needed space, like it does speak to people. It's not for everybody, but it is really a space to break down the structures that can thwart vitality and potency, and really to just let it all out, just let it all out in a safe enough space to be full spectrum.
A lot of what you were talking about right now, blending these different modalities, and when you talked about blending science and philosophy and art with the, how do you pronounce it? Mathesis universalis?
Oh yeah, mathesis, as in mathematics, weirdly enough.
Okay.
Yeah, Mathesis Universalis, and Giordano Bruno got burned at the stake for that shit, for attempting to do that.
It can feel that way, I think, in today's society, trying to blend the world of magic and maybe a bit more of the softer, the woo or the cosmic with the harder Western scientific approaches. And one thing I've heard you talk about is being on this mission to re-enchant science. And I think that's just such a lovely way to phrase this. And yeah, I was hoping you could speak on just a little bit on that, of what that means for you.
Yeah, science came from magic. It came from the magicians, basically, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right? It came from the laboratory alchemists who were interested in magic, the magic being in a universe that was alive. And when you get into the literature, you realize how interwoven the early laboratories and the origins of the scientific method were woven together. And then over time, there's this splitting that starts to happen between the real scientists and the kind of the esoteric idiots or superstitious people that are evil and weird or something over there. And then on this side of the equation, there's the esotericists who are into the magic, looking over at science going, oh, you mechanistic freaks. You're just basically like robots that you understand nothing. And in order to understand anything, you have to come into our cult and get initiated and broken down by our methodologies in order to truly see. Re-enchanting science means connecting with the beginnings of it, which is, to me, the place where it all comes together anyways, where the beginning is also the cutting edge of the future. To understand origins gives us a kind of better understanding of how to take leaps into innovative ways of being and becoming.